James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, for the opportunity to speak on the KiwiSaver Budget Measures Bill. I'm going to take, I hope, a slightly different approach, but I'd like to start by acknowledging both Mr Brownlee and Mr Bennett for actually taking full calls on this bill and actually providing some form of argument in this debate, because previous budget debates over the last few days, the government members haven't actually even bothered to speak to their own bills, haven't actually bothered to lay out the case. They've just relied on their numbers. So I do appreciate the fact that Mr Brownlee and Mr Bennett did actually take full calls on this, even if they relied more on volume than reason to make their arguments. Mr Speaker, there are a number of key points that I'd like to address, and I'm inviting the government to respond directly to these points, because I haven't yet heard any real arguments.
Yeah, I'm sorry, there's noise from both sides at the moment, and it is a bit hard to hear the member.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Yeah, so I was just saying that I'm actually inviting the government to respond specifically to these points. So the first one is around New Zealand's savings rate. So we are 22nd out of 24 OECD countries still in our savings rate, which is, even given the success of the KiwiSaver scheme over the last few years, a shockingly low rate of savings. We are a country that relies more on debt than we do on savings. We have weak capital markets, partially as a result of this. National's savings working group itself said that our foreign debt is too high. This makes us vulnerable, and our domestic savings are essential to try and redress that. Our investment needs to be funded from offshore because we don't have the domestic savings to provide those sort of capital markets. Removing the incentive from KiwiSaver and reducing the likelihood that more people will be joining the KiwiSaver scheme reduces our domestic savings rate. So I would like to know, absent the incentive, what is the government's plan to increase New Zealand's savings rate? So that's the first point, Mr Speaker. Two is around the loss of the incentive, and I'd like to thank David Clark for his contribution before about behavioural economics, which is a more recent evolution in economic thinking. And the question here is, why would you take away the incentive? Absent compulsion, why would you take away the primary incentive? It's the one that most people know about. ANZ Chief Economist Cameron Bagrie said this morning, in this morning's Dominion, that he himself, the ANZ's Chief Economist, would not have put his kids into KiwiSaver if it wasn't for the $1,000 incentive. So the $1,000 incentive is the most well-known component of the whole scheme. There are other other incentives still contained in the scheme, as Mr Brownlee said, which include the tax rebate, the matching contributions, and so on. But actually, my belief is that the government would have been better off to cut or remove the tax rebate than the $1,000 contribution. That would have probably had more fiscal impact, but it would have retained the incentive, the $1,000 incentive. That's what people think of when they think about the incentive of the scheme. So as far as I can work out, what you're going to see is a reduction in the number of people, or the percentage of people, who are taking up the scheme. So I'd like to know, what is the government's response to the loss of that incentive? How do you actually expect the same percentage or equivalent to continue to join the scheme absent the $1,000 incentive? The third question is around the timing of the loss of the incentive. So if, for example, you'd said that this would take effect in 6 months or 12 months or 2 years, there would have been a window where people said, okay, there's still an incentive, but I've got to get in now, or it's going to be lost. Even if you'd given it a week, you'd see a rush of people joining the scheme. And one of the previous speakers on the government side said, well, look, if people haven't joined the scheme now, what's the likelihood that they ever will? You know, given that we've had the incentive for all of these years, what are the chances that they're going to do that? If there'd been a time limit, and if my reading of behavioural economics is anything to go by, there's a lot of people who are out there thinking, oh yeah, I'll get to it one day, but it's a bit complicated, it's a bit hard, I don't have enough money quite now, I'll get to it. If you'd left a window and said, let's give this 6 months or 12 months, and then the incentive would go, yes, it would cost you a bit more money, but you'd get that tail of people who just hadn't quite gotten around to it. But instead, by cutting it off immediately, there's no chance for people who were thinking about it but hadn't gotten to it to get to it. So I'd like a response to that, please, as well. The next one is about intergenerational equity. So the current generation of parents with young kids who are working are paying for their kids' education through the high tertiary fees and costs. They're paying for their own retirement because they know that by the time they get to retirement age, there isn't going to be enough cash in the kitty to give them proper super. And they're paying for their parents' retirements through taxation in the form of the existing super scheme. So the current generation of families who are working are getting squeezed in terms of paying for 3 generations at once. And in removing this, you're actually making it even harder for intergenerational equity to take place. So I'd like some kind of sense of, well, what's your kind of plan to redress some of the intergenerational issues that arise out of this? The 5th point is around the short term versus the long term, and I think Labour have made this point very well and frequently already in the course of this debate, which is every time the government gets concerned about its short-term books, it relies on kicking the can down the road in terms of the long-term fiscal sustainability of the country. So they cut the contributions to the super fund in order to try and maintain the books. Now they're cutting the KiwiSaver incentive, basically funding a short-term balancing the books from New Zealand's superannuation schemes and retirement schemes. So I'd like some sense of what's your long-term plan? How are you going to fix the long-term future rather than just deal with the short-term? So those are my main points, Mr. Speaker. What do we do? What's the government's plan to deal with the New Zealand savings rate? What's the government's plan to deal with the loss of the incentive that this then happens, and how do they expect the rate of take-up to stay the same or even increase? What's the impact on the rate of take-up of KiwiSaver when the incentive is lost? Why didn't they consider a window to get people in who were thinking about it, is the 3rd point. 4th point is around intergenerational equity, and the 5th point is around the long-term versus the short-term nature of this decision. So there are 5 questions there that I would like answered during the course of this debate, more bombastically or less bombastically, as takes your pleasure, but I would like to hear those. So middle and income earners are struggling to save. I mean, we know that. Under National, those who are saving are the people who really can save, that is upper middle and upper income families. And what this does is that this takes away the incentive and a little bit of savings for people at the bottom end of the pile. People who could not get $1,000 together. What's your plan for the impact on inequality that the loss of the $1,000 is going to have? So we've got a number of SOPs that will come up during the next part of the debate, which are in relation to restoring or retaining the $1,000 kickstart for people who have got community services cards, which would deal with some of those issues. We've got the Kiwi KiwiSaver program that we launched about a couple of weeks ago, a progressive savings component to it, all of which are designed to deal with some of the issues that I've raised during the course of this. And so I just wanted to flag that we'll be speaking to those soon. But we've got some ideas about how to deal with some of those issues. I'd like to hear what is the government's plan for dealing with those kinds of issues. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
Fletcher.